Welcome to WebRTC Live. In WebRTC Live, we cover the latest technical topics and business use cases for WebRTC and live video. As always, this episode is brought to you by WebRTC.Ventures.
Hey, I'm Aaron Syme, CEO and founder of WebRTC.Ventures. A big announcement from Twilio Video that instead of doing the end of life, shutting down Twilio Video in this December of 2024, they're extending it 2 extra years until December of 2026. Now, this is great news for the larger clients of Twilio Video who were nervous about being able to make a major architectural migration in less than a year. So that's great news for them. But this is bad news for me. So I'm asking for your help because now I have to write 2 more years of blog posts about Twilio Video migrations, and I don't want to do that. I don't think you want me to do that either. So let's help each other out here. How about we agree to make 2024 still the year that you do your Twilio Video migration so we can all stop talking about this and move on to something else. All right, so if you want to accelerate your Twilio Video migration in 2024, reach out to us at WebRTC.Ventures and let's go ahead and do this. Come on, we can do this. If we work together, people, let's make 2024 the year you move on to some other CPaaS open source media server. Let's do this.
As always, this episode is brought to you by WebRTC.Ventures, leading integrators of WebRTC Video into your custom application.
Welcome back to WebRTC Live. I'm your host, Aaron Syme, founder and CEO of WebRTC.Ventures. WebRTC.Ventures is a custom design and development agency focused on building live video applications. We're here to help you take your application live. You can learn more about us at WebRTC.Ventures. Thanks for joining us live today on YouTube, LinkedIn, and Twitch. Welcome also to any of you watching a replay of today's event. For those of you with us live, you can ask questions throughout the stream by leaving a comment in whichever platform you're viewing this. And also make sure you stick around for the end of today's episode, where we'll have our industry analysis segment with Sahi Levent-Levi. Sahi and I will discuss if winter is coming for WebRTC and what the future of the WebRTC standard looks like. For today's episode, though, I am joined by Dan Jenkins, founder at Nimble and Everycast Labs, as well as founder of the CommCon conference series. Thanks for joining me today, Dan.
Thank you for having me.
Always a pleasure to have you. Let's start with a little update on CommCon. Tell us about what's going on there.
So, if you're a keen viewer of WebRTC Live, you should have seen an announcement, I think, last month. So we're back this year. We're on tour. I've noticed quite a few of other events are on tour as well this year. It seems a trend. So we're in London 5th and 6th of June. So I think, and then 5th and 6th of June, and then we're in San Francisco the 12th and 13th of June, literally a week later. And we've just started accepting our speakers. Some of them are already up on the website. We haven't done any proper announcements yet, but you can go on the website and you can go and see speakers. And I can tell you, we don't have a single repeated speaker in either location. So you essentially get 2 different conferences with 2 different sets of speakers and all of the video on demand from both completely free. So it's going to be fantastic events. So 5th and 6th, 12th and 13th. So there's 1-day hackathon, 1-day conference at both of the locations. So yes, we've started putting speakers up on the website, but we haven't announced them yet. So like we've got Ali, we've got Christoph, we've got Joran from Sipgate, Razvan from the SIP Hub team, the OpenSIPs team, Tim Panton in London, and then in San Francisco, we've got names like Fred, Jeff, and Renan and Sean. So Sean, you should know from the Pion project, Renan from Cloudflare. Cloudflare are hosting us this year. And then we've got people like Fred and Luke. Luke's going to be talking about media over QUIC. So we've got this huge kind of array of topics I'm really, really excited about.
That's awesome. Thank you, Dan. Yeah, that's a great lineup of speakers for sure. 2 excellent events. So definitely hope that our viewers check that out.
And before we move on, you're sponsoring, aren't you?
I am sponsoring. That's right. And very proud to be a sponsor again of CommCon.
So thank you very much for sponsoring. Without sponsors, the event just doesn't happen, right? Yeah. Ticket sales, don't really cover an awful lot in terms of, spending money to actually make an event happen. It's the sponsors that make it actually possible. So thank you.
Our pleasure. I mean, these sorts of events are great for companies like ours, and for anybody who's interested in WebRTC. I mean, really no better place to really get to meet a lot of insiders and the movers and shakers around WebRTC and the technologies and standards behind it. So yeah, super cool events, and appreciate all the work that you do in putting in, organizing it, you and your team, Dan. Thank you. So for today, we're going to talk about a range of broadcasting topics. Kind of cover a lot of ground here, probably. A lot of the work that you do is around broadcasting with WebRTC, right? But there's a lot of other words and terms beyond just WebRTC being used in the space. It's not just WebRTC and HLS anymore. There's a lot of other acronyms people need to learn, and different technologies to consider. So we'll kind of roll through some of those, and looking forward to hearing your perspective on that, Dan. Maybe we can start with a little bit with like WHEP and WHEP, some definitions around that. What are they good for?
Yeah, so anyone that's been kind of doing anything with WebRTC for the past couple of years should know what the terms WHEP and WHEP stand for. But if you don't, so WHEP stands for the WebRTC HTTP ingest protocol, and WHEP stands for the WebRTC HTTP egress protocol. I have to think about it every single time because it should be ingress and egress, and I will fight this battle with Sergio every single day of the week. Sergio helped basically made the specs. So I'd love for ingest to be changed to ingress, but I'm getting distracted already. So WHEP, let's take WHEP first. WHEP is being able to form a WebRTC session with another peer, whether or not that's a server. It could even be another peer behind another firewall if you do it properly. But ultimately, it's a signaling protocol that's based off of HTTP. You do a post with an offer, and then you get an answer back from that post. There's other things in there as well. You do options requests for things, and you do patch requests for other things, and you do delete requests to do other things. Sounds very much like a RESTful API, doesn't it? And that's the idea. You should be able to kind of form a WebRTC session with almost one HTTP request response, and that's it. You might need to do a bit of trickle ice here and there with some other requests, but if you go into a server, you might not even need to do trickle ice. So it makes it really, really easy to get going, sending your media from A to B in really low latency, right? Remember, we're sending media from a browser or another, WebRTC device in 40 milliseconds or even less in some cases. So it's meant to be really simple to be able to send low latency media. But what happens if you want to receive that low latency media? Well, today, before WHEP, you would have to, write this custom stuff and to be able to talk to a custom media server somewhere, whether or not that was hosted by Twilio Video or whoever, right? So WHEP is exactly the same as WHIP, but it's the other way. It's I want to receive this media, and I want to do an HTTP request with an offer. There's a bit of debate here. I'd love server offers here, but part of the spec today is you do an offer from the client to say, right, I can accept audio and video, and then the server says, I've got some video for you, and it's in this format. So WHIP is almost at the end of its journey through the IETF, and it's almost a proper spec. WHEP is still quite far away from that end of being a proper spec. It's a draft, but it means you can write really nice things that, you know, publish from A and then you receive in B, with essentially doing, you know, 2 HTTP calls, and that's it. So we've seen new players come into the market. So as an example, there's Cloudflare with Cloudflare Stream. They support WHIP and WHEP in Cloudflare Stream. And you can, it basically means that you can send media from a browser, from OBS, from wherever, anything that understands how to do WHIP, and then you can stream it to, you know, 1 person, 10 people, 100 people, tens of thousands of people, depending on the platform that you're streaming to. And that's really, really, really powerful in low latency. And that's something that we've not been able to do before, to the scale that we're doing it at, from potentially a browser. Like, if you think about it, how did you used to send media up to, say, YouTube or whoever? Well, you'd send it via RTMP, or you'd send it via maybe SRT. YouTube now supports SRT, and we'll come to SRT later. So you couldn't really stream from a browser, right? And there were lots of hacks. Like, we're using StreamYard today, and like, I know early iterations, I'm not sure how it's done today, but early iterations at least would kind of take this StreamYard thing, and it would take the whole browser and it would screen capture the whole browser, and then it would send it off to YouTube. Well, now you don't have to have that middle step. You can just kind of capture it within a browser and send it straight there. So it's opening the doors for an awful lot of flexibility and a lot of scalability and low latency.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting possibilities now in the space. I mean, you know, point to a WebRTC Hacks article from last year talking about WHIP being integrated into OBS now, right? So being able to take a conferencing stream, for example, put that into OBS, use that, and then send it back out. But, you know, even in the past with something like, you know, and originally you had to do that. There was a forked version of OBS that Dr. Alex's group had put together, and Millicast, and now that can be done directly within OBS, right? So yeah, that's on that ingress side, that ingestion side. But you were often still streaming out to something else like HLS, right? You were still streaming out in a more traditional delayed protocol. So now we've got the opportunity to use WebRTC on both sides. So, you know, here just pulling up a graphic from Sahi's Blog Geek site talking about WHIP and WHEP. So we have the opportunity to do this on both ends of it now, which is pretty interesting. Yeah, a lot of possibilities there.
Yeah, I mean, even getting rid of those like 5 seconds, like if you're doing low latency HLS, then that can be 3 to 5 seconds instead of, you know, HLS/dash being, you know, 7 to 10 ish. Let's say.
Yeah, exactly.
Like even getting rid of 3-4 seconds is huge. It opens up so many new possibilities. And before, like there was very limited flexibility to be able to do this nicely and simply. And now we're seeing players come into the market that just make it super simple. You sign up and you start sending media, and then you go and do an HTTP request to get media, and then it's done, right? It's not quite that simple, but it's a lot simpler than it used to be. And the fact that you can basically get almost end-to-end transmission to delivery with, you know, 1 or 2 HTTP calls and a bit more. And end-to-end, you know, that's 80 milliseconds, 90 milliseconds worth of delay. I mean, let's be generous and just say 200 milliseconds worth of delay, right? Like, that's huge compared to, you know, 3, 5, 7 seconds. Like, that's the order of magnitude of difference.
Yeah. And that latency matters in a lot of use cases in broadcasting. When you're trying to do interactive broadcasting, when you're trying to do real-time chat, for example. We already got a nice little comment here from WebRTC Hacks congratulating us on using their post in there, right? The longer that delay is, the longer it would take us to see that comment, obviously. But our viewers will have to trust us that I got that very quickly here in the comments section after putting up that post. So Chad is watching closely, I assume. But we do have another comment as well here, a question around WHEP from Josh. Did WHEP take any influence from SIP, Dan?
As far as I'm aware, no. Ultimately, SIP is actually quite a chatty protocol in the grand scheme of things. If you ignore, if you take offer and answer out of the equation, because offer answer is just part of WebRTC, and that was taken from VoIP, right? Was taken from that. So WebRTC in itself was influenced by SIP, I guess, and from VoIP in general, but WHEP itself wasn't. It ultimately it tries to be as little as less chatty, whatever the phrase I'm trying to say is, as quiet as possible. Whereas SIP is still quite verbose in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, verbose. That's the fancy word you were looking for there for chatty. So yeah, thank you for that question, Josh. Dan, you mentioned the WHEP standard is a little bit behind WHEP right now, and there was an IETF meeting, I think, recently. Josh says less chatty works just fine, by the way. Thank you, Josh, for that. But what do you know what they were discussing in that, and is there any particular reason that WHEP is a little bit further behind WHEP?
WHEP's just further behind because it got started later. Basically, Sergio and the people behind the IETF group that was behind WHEP basically wanted to get WHEP almost done before they then moved on to WHEP, is my understanding. Because ultimately, a lot of the problems that they were going to kind of face were going to be the same. And so there was kind of no point having multiple discussions in multiple places at slightly different times. Let's try and get WHEP done and see what, I think this was another thing, see what the reaction was from the industry that was outside of, core WebRTC people. Because like we all love WebRTC, but there's a whole load of other people from broadcast that think WebRTC is horrible because, it degrades and it gets rid of media when it needs to, and it drops packets, right? And this is all bad when it comes to broadcast. And so I think it was just, A, they were started at different times. B, they wanted to get WHEP kind of right and done almost before starting WHEP. And then C, probably the most important one was, can we even get things like OBS and GStreamer and FFmpeg and like being able to get behind WHEP? Because if no one else got behind it, then it was kind of a useless journey.
Yeah. But the WHEP is behind primarily due to a congestion or a queuing problem, then not a technical issue there. Just one after the other, queue them up. Yeah, you mentioned broadcasters and kind of and we were talking before going on our air a little bit about the NAB show, which I think is next week, and I've been there, and we were talking about just the huge scope that is underneath the term broadcasting, and so obviously people are going to come at that with different perspectives. And for us in kind of the WebRTC world, we're most interested in low latency and getting something there to users, which is a little bit different than somebody whose priority is getting the highest quality thing there to them, even if it's late. And so maybe that's a little bit a comment here from Malaka 2024. I don't understand why they don't like WebRTC, referring to your broadcasting comment. Even Cisco swapped to RTC with Genesis.
I mean, it really depends on what is your end goal, right? And like later on, we'll come on to the topic of media over QUIC and some of the stuff that Luke is doing, for example. Luke speaking at CommCon. That's the only reason that Luke's popped into my head around media over QUIC. And how we've got many different kind of use cases. And that's kind of a really cool thing that we've got at the moment. And maybe this is a really good segue onto media over QUIC. Like, we're now living in this world where, you know, a browser can do loads of things that it couldn't do 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago, right? 10, 12 years ago, we had WebRTC. 13 years ago, I can't remember how old WebRTC is now. It's very old in the grand scheme of things. It's a teenager. And so, like, for a very long time now, we've only been able to send media out of a browser. And the reason why I talk about browsers so much is they're on every single device, and you can go to a URL within seconds of booting that device up, and it just works, right? Like, you don't have to install something from an app store. You don't have to log into an app store. Your device comes with a browser. It might not be the best browser in the world. I'm looking at like Safari, not Safari. Safari's got better. I'm looking at Samsung browser. Anyway, but across every single mobile device, you can go to a URL, and it will load up, and then you can share your media wherever, whether or not that's with WebRTC, or whether or not that's with something new like WebTransport and WebCodec, and being able to send media in a more controlled way. That's a good way of talking about it, right? WebRTC is very much a black box when it comes in the browser. It's very much a black box. You put your media into it and it sends it, and because ultimately all the browsers are using libWebRTC underneath. With WebTransport and WebCodec, you've now got control over, like, you know, how much delay do we put in, how much other stuff do we put in, and so we've now, in the past, you know, 3 years or so, suddenly got this extra superpower that's kind of making its way into web browsers. It's really an exciting time when it comes to delivering media from any device in the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And as Malaka followed up and said, yeah, it's great. You can just, WebRTC just loads and works. So yeah, you touched there on the elephant in the room, unbundling, WebTransport, WebCodec, QUIC. And this is something Sahi and I will talk a little bit more about too in the industry analysis segment at the end of today's episode. But you know, you see now a post kind of like this one here, saying, how are we going to replace WebRTC with media over QUIC? This one has a nice summary of the, you know, saying if you primarily use WebRTC for real-time media, it's going to take a while to replace that. If you're primarily using it for data channels, WebTransport, it's great, it works. If you're using it for a true peer-to-peer application, then you're definitely stuck with WebRTC for the foreseeable future. But I don't know, is it so bad being stuck with WebRTC for the foreseeable future? You know, tell us a little bit about kind of, you know, your perspective on unbundling and media over QUIC and some of the advantages and disadvantages that you see there.
So, I mean, we are, like I say, WebRTC is now a teenager, and it's become very, very robust, let's say. And ultimately, it's still getting new, like, JavaScript APIs to be able to do extra things, even today. So it's not a dead thing. Like, it is naturally progressing. That rate of progression, I think Sahi mentioned this in his recent talk, RTC at Scale, was how extra features have slowed down in WebRTC in general. But that's just a sign of age, and it's a sign of robustness, and the fact that there's only so much you can do. WebTransport and WebCodec and media over QUIC, well, that's really very, very interesting, because it means that for those people that want to go off and, you know, really tweak this codec to do this specific thing, well, now they've got the ability to be able to do that. I mentioned this in a blog, a video thing that I did with Alan Quayle a couple of weeks ago. This is actually a danger thing for WebRTC, I think. Unless WebRTC kind of opens the doors a little bit and allows us as developers to say, right, well, we don't want, let's take an audio codec, one of these new audio codecs as an example, right? A AI-driven audio codec that, you know, sends very, very little data, but is amazing quality. Well, today, you can't really use that in WebRTC. Now, if you go and Google it, people have done it, but they're doing it by lying, right? You cheat. You ask the get user media called for raw media, basically, and then you use insertable streams to be able to kind of compress it, but you tell it that it's a different codec than it really is. And then the other end needs to go, I've received this codec, but it's really this other codec that nothing in the offer answer process, the SDP, actually tells you about. So there's ways of doing it today, but it's very, very hacky, let's say. Whereas WebTransport, WebCodec is enabling the proper way of doing that. So I think we potentially get into a danger zone with WebRTC getting left behind as such, where, well, you're stuck with what's built into libWebRTC, or you're stuck with what the browser wants to make available to you. And we're seeing more and more of, you know, new stuff being developed, and at a very, very fast rate. I think in the past 3 years, we've had 3 new audio codecs that do different things in different ways. Now, obviously, not all of those can make their way into libWebRTC, but this is where, you know, Sahi's talking about unbundling and forking of libWebRTC and whatever else to be able to do this extra stuff. Well, ultimately, you can do that if you've got a native device, because you've got control over which fork of libWebRTC you're running. But if your browser has, you know, the version of libWebRTC, then you can't interop. So where am I going with this very long ramble? Ultimately, we've got a load of flexibility coming, but it means that you're having to really be in control, right? If you want to send media from A to B, then you need to have, you know, a codec that you're going to put stuff into, and then you need to have a way of sending that media up to a server over QUIC, and these are all kind of, they might be open source things, but they're kind of proprietary at the end of the day, right? They're like, it's not WebRTC that kind of just works. So there's ease with WebRTC, but there's also complexity with WebRTC, because, you know, you're constrained to the way that libWebRTC works. It's very important to not get the two confused. WebRTC is a set of standards. libWebRTC is a project that Google kind of mostly controls, and is the open source implementation of WebRTC. There's lots of other open source implementations of WebRTC now, Pion being one of them in Go. So you don't have to use libWebRTC, but that's the biggest one, because that's what's used in all of the browsers. So yeah, we get into this kind of, there's pros and cons on lots of different levels, right? It's important to remember why WebTransport and WebCodec kind of became more of a thing, and it was because of Zoom. So Zoom in the browser didn't like having to use the stuff built within libWebRTC. They wanted more control, and so they would get their video and audio and do stuff to it, and then they'd send it over a WebRTC data channel, because it was the only way. The replacing WebRTC blog post that you were just talking about talks about it. It used to be the only way to get UDP out of a browser, the WebRTC data channel. So it gives us a lot of flexibility to be able to do loads of great things, and this is really exciting for like the whole industry. But we're still we're actually still in early days in the whole picture.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting to think, because WebRTC was, you know, originally designed more with meeting conference type of implementations, use cases in mind. we're talking about using it broadcasting here, and so it gets more complicated. And there's ways with cascading SFUs that it's been done, and now it's being built more into things like OBS. So it's more and more accepted in the broadcasting world, by at least some people in the broadcasting world, some not so much, right? But then, and the beauty of it has always been that it's been relatively easy to work with, but it is a bit of a black box, as you said earlier, for most people using it. But now we have the good and the bad outcome here of it unbundling and sort of more options for implementing this. So if you want to do something with a special audio codec, if you want to do your own manipulation of video frames, that sort of thing, you can. But you're gonna, you just have to do a lot more work around it, and you may be using things that are really not WebRTC at all, eventually in that, right? So yeah, it's a very interesting space right now, I think.
But like that blog post very quickly said, like if you want to do real-time media over something that isn't WebRTC, we're still really far away from actually being able to do this properly. Media over QUIC as a body within the IETF has really concentrated on replacing Dash, replacing HLS. Now you can send media over QUIC very, very quickly, whether or not that's media over QUIC the spec, or whether or not that's just generic media over QUIC or RTP over QUIC or whatever. We have to be careful about terms here, but if you want to do proper real-time media over QUIC in a really nice, uniform, standardized way, we're actually really far away from that as a proper ITF type thing. Whereas today you can go and do it with WebRTC really quite nicely.
Well, I mean, it's a little, looking back at the history of WebRTC, right? It was, I think 2012 was the first time I saw someone, a Google engineer, talking about WebRTC at a conference. That was what piqued my interest in it. But it wasn't until 4 or 5 years ago that we reached the 1.0 standard and browser, true browser compatibility. So so that took 8+ years from the time that I personally first heard about it, right? So we're talking about a lot of these things right now that you can use them in certain scenarios, and they may be the right choice to use in certain scenarios now, but it's definitely still cutting edge and is likely to still take years before you would be using these as realistic alternatives to real-time media in most use cases. But we have to start working with them now to learn about it, right? And this is something I think you've had some experience using things like WHEP and WHEP. Tell me a little bit about what has that experience been like working with this so far. What sort of maybe annoying bugs or interesting things are you running into?
Not really annoying bugs. That because the specs are so simple. Like, right, you send an offer and then you get back an answer, and that's really nice and simple. And if you need to send an extraized candidate, it's an extra request. So it's actually been really, really nice. I mean, because of key players within the community / industry, people like Sean Dubois, he went and painstakingly added WHEP support into OBS. The Millercast fork that you were talking about earlier was very much a Millercast fork, right? It was kind of shoved into OBS. No disrespect to the Millercast team. Sure. It was kind of shoved into OBS, and it worked with Millercast only, mostly. And fair dues, right? They released it as a Millercast thing, and it's the same as all of these other minor forks of OBS to be able to stream to one particular thing. Sean really painstakingly went to the effort of making WHEP / WebRTC support in OBS proper, right? And it's without these vital people within the industry / community, then, well, where does that growth, where does that usage of WHEP come from? There are really cool, nice things that we can now do. So like a really great example is being able to do an element capture within a browser now. So you don't have to do a tab capture, you can do an element capture. It's going through the process of becoming a proper thing, but you can go and use it in Chrome today, and you can capture a very particular element, which means you can capture a very particular part of the screen, the web page that you're looking at. And so you can capture that, including the audio from that tab, and then you can broadcast it, like, and in very, very, very simply. And then you can go and, you know, make that available as a single web page that just views that one element to, you know, a million different browsers. That's really, really, really powerful, and we've not had that simplicity ever up until now. So it's really, really great, and ultimately, I guess the big win is the protocol, the spec is simple, which means that you can go and build very, very quickly on top of it. And so we have a broadcast bridge with our product. You can do ingest using WHEP, and I think it was probably like 50 lines of Node that went and talked to our media server. So it's a really, really cool, flexible thing that just makes sense.
Nice. Yeah, and we're starting to run out of time here, so I do want to bring it back and hear more about your work with Broadcast Bridge. So tell us a little bit about that, and you know, sort of the problems that you're solving with that.
Yeah, it goes back to what I was saying earlier with how I think browsers are the best, right? Like historically, if you wanted to say join a live stream, or live stream is probably a bad example, but if you were joining if you were remote presenting to a conference talk, you'd end up using something like Zoom or Teams, and the other end would end up kind of screen capturing you and doing weird things. This is the same with broadcasters. The amount of times I've seen and heard many stories from actual broadcasters where they get someone that they want to appear on the news, right? And the news is the best example, right? Because they're constantly bringing in remote guests, and so they would say, well, do you have FaceTime? And the person would go, no, I've got an Android phone. Ah, okay. Well, what else can we use? Oh, we could use Zoom. No, I don't have Zoom on my phone. Well, how? So the being able to just get rid of apps completely and just make Broadcast Bridge, for the most part, as a consumer, just work in a browser is hugely, hugely powerful. So yes, we make it very, very easy to be able to bring in a remote guest into a broadcast, into a conference as a remote presenter, and we make it really, really simple, and in a way that not many people are doing, and ultimately we're utilizing open source technologies to be able to do, 99% of everything. We do SRT ingest, but really, little secret, our SRT ingest is actually SRT in, but then it goes via WHEP straight into a WebRTC media server, because ultimately the codec that's used for the most part in SRT is also applicable to WebRTC. And so we're able to kind of just pipe it through without transcoding it or anything. So we're trying to make it really, really easy for AV professionals, for broadcasters in particular. And so you stop seeing those little name tags at the bottom of the screen that tell you what their name is or what audio mode they're in or whatever.
Right.
The amount of TV shows that I watch where they bring someone remote in and you can tell what app they're using just by what the name looks like.
Right.
So yeah, no, it's been an interesting journey. We started it during the pandemic, and we're organically growing. So yeah, no, it's been an interesting thing, learning more about like broadcast people and what they expect from media versus what I expect from media.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and so maybe along those lines, let's wrap up with a little bit of just a couple thoughts on the future of this. What do you see as kind of the intersection or the ultimate winner of all of these different options? Or are we going to, people like you and I going to continue to work with all of them?
I think people will continue to work with all of them. My biggest fear, very quickly, is the WebRTC. WebRTC is not going to die, but when media over QUIC, when WebTransport, when WebCodec kind of becomes more of a thing, will the likes of Google and Microsoft and Cisco and all of these big players that kind of came together to make WebRTC what it is today, well, they've all kind of got annoyed with being constrained by WebRTC at the same time. They've all had to make compromises. Right. Whereas now with media over QUIC, well, they've got the potential to not be constrained anymore, and they can go and do their own thing. And so are we about to see a shift in WebRTC where there's less interest in it from those big players, and that interest properly shifts over to media over QUIC, to QUIC in general? It's an interesting time. It'll be the next 2 or 3 years will be very, very interesting from what is the future going to hold.
Yeah. Well, that's an excellent segue to our closing segment today, the industry analysis with Sahi. So we'll go to that in a moment. But first, Dan, I want to thank you for joining me today. Really appreciate it. And any other closing thoughts anything else you wanted to make sure that we discussed today?
No, I don't think so. CommCon, 5th and 6th of June in London, 12th and 13th of June in San Francisco, being hosted in the Cloudflare offices. Thank you very much to Cloudflare. And then if you've noticed my t-shirt during this session, you can go and buy it on the Everycast Labs website, everycastlabs.uk. I think it's a really cool t-shirt. It's something that we made ourselves.
It is cool. I've seen it. And for Broadcast Bridge, broadcastbridge.app to learn more about that as well. So yeah, thank you so much. A number of nice comments coming in here. So yeah, Dan, thank you very much. Also some props for your shout out of Pion there earlier. And Josh, agreeing with you that the different big players not only getting annoyed with limitation of WebRTC perhaps, but with each other. So lots of great comments today. Appreciate it. Dan, thank you for all of your insights. Appreciate that very much. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
All right. So now let's remember to stick around because we will have Sahi joining us in just a moment for an industry analysis segment. First, I want to remind you that this video will be available on the WebRTC.ventures YouTube channel, as well as on our blog at WebRTC.ventures. Our next episode of WebRTC Live will be Wednesday, May 15th. I'll be speaking with Jim Rand and James Meyer from Cinervoss about audio-specific use cases and tech with WebRTC. So I'm looking forward to that conversation. To find more about any of our upcoming episodes, follow us on social media at WebRTC.ventures on Twitch, LinkedIn, YouTube. Join our email list at WebRTC.ventures. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today. Let's make it live. Sahi, thanks for joining me for another industry analysis segment. Great to have you here as always.
Same here. Always fun, Aaron.
Let's get right to it. You posted the question on LinkedIn recently, is winter coming for WebRTC? What did you mean by that?
Well, do you want to share that so I actually remember what I did there? Okay, so if you think about it, WebRTC started as a kind of an open source project, community, whatever. Yes, it was Google, but it took something that was up until that point proprietary and made that part of the larger industry that we have. Before that, if you had to do something with voice and video over the web, you had to go purchase a lot of components and then build something with them. Open source, not open source, that was the actual thing that you had to do. When WebRTC came out, first of all, it was open source. It was part of the browser. And we had codecs that were royalty free as well. It started with WP8 and Opus, and now we've got Opus, WP8, WP9, and AV1. I'm ignoring the paid for codecs. What you start seeing in the last few years is that the innovations and additions that come into WebRTC might or might not be part of WebRTC itself. Okay, if I give an example, Google has a new codec called Lyra, low bandwidth. Yes, it is open source. It's not part of WebRTC. You can hook it up with WebRTC. Microsoft has a low bandwidth codec as well called Satin. Amazon has their own spiel there. Cisco has their own new AI codec for audio. Meta has their NMLO codec. So it seems like we're back to a kind of a war, an armament war around codecs that might or not be part of WebRTC at the end of it. Once someone wins, we might end up with codecs that are not aligned or that not everyone has access to. And we see it in other places as well. So a lot of the focus now is around how do I use machine learning, but outside of WebRTC, because we don't know, the excuse is we don't know exactly what the use cases are going to be. So let's give the power to the developers. But this power also means that nothing is going to trickle back into WebRTC itself. So whatever investments people made is theirs and theirs alone. It's both good and bad, depending where you are. So that was the kind of things that I was alluding to.
Okay. So are we going back to the bad old world of browser incompatibilities then with a trend like this? Is that a reasonable fear for me to have?
It's a good question. I think the answer is no. We're going to the, let's say, dark ages of WebRTC when we had Google and maybe Chrome and maybe a bit of Firefox, but Safari was backwards, because people are going to use also things like WebTransport and WebCodecs, and these aren't quite standard across browsers yet.
Right.
But we're still going to be able to use all these things in the browser. The thing is this. Let's fast forward 5 years from now. We're going to use probably mostly VP9 or AV1. I'd like to think that it's going to be AV1 5 years into the future. I think it would be too early to say that everything is AV1, but we will have a lot of AV1. What would be the audio codec exactly at that point? Would that still be Opus, or would that be something different? Would that something that is different be proprietary per vendor? Because now I can build it using WebAssembly and stitch it into WebRTC with insertable streams and other curses that we now have in WebRTC that enable us to do these things. Because if I can do that, then you don't need to worry from the browser perspective, but you need to worry from connectivity. Okay, we have now the DMA, the Digital Marketing Act, or whatever that is in Europe, that essentially forces all large social networks to be able to open up their networks for others. We start seeing them doing that. Meta came out with how you connect to WhatsApp and to our other domains with technical details. Likely, they would end up opening up the voice and video part using WebRTC. Probably first because they support it, and second because, well, it's the only reasonable thing to do on the browser. So this is going to be a mechanism to interact across different networks, but would that be how inwardly things would be used, or would that become the lowest common denominator? So let's think about it this way, okay? In a way, I think that WebRTC is becoming so good that it's going to be the G711 of the voice over IP world. It's going to be just workable, but that's about it. Nobody will want to use it, but it's always there. It's ubiquitous. Mm-hmm. And I think that's where my worry is, that the big vendors are going to do a lot of improvements, but they're not going to give them to others or expose them to others, just to have the differentiation that they need. And this is just market realities. It's not like this is what I want, or this is what I preach, or it is what it is.
So it fits a little bit within, it sounds like, this larger trend or parallel path, at least, of unbundling versus WebRTC, right? And so your concern is not that correct me if I'm wrong here, it's not that WebRTC is going to go away. It's more like it's always there. It's ubiquitous. It's this great like base level, but it becomes a little bit stale in comparison perhaps to some of the capabilities that proprietary tools would have.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, you said it a lot better than I could.
Well, and so what's the, what do you see as kind of the impact for that on, say, those of us who work with open source or proprietary APIs and building more custom applications and use cases around that, perhaps we have to, is it like an issue where if you're using an open source library, you're never going to quite achieve the same level of quality that maybe could happen in a FaceTime call or something more proprietary because they're not using open standards, right? And so we just have to accept that, or
yes, the answer is yes. And I guess the reason is that now the current competition is not about the technology. If you look just at the market at large, at the technology market, it's not that I have better code than you have. It's that I have more data than you have, hence my AI algorithms are better trained and more honed and fine-tuned than yours.
Right.
Okay, so the bigger the companies, the more fine-tuned I can make my algorithms. And you can't, because, especially you, because you're an outsourcing vendor, you do work for others,
right?
And you move from one product to another. So you accumulate knowledge and know-how and access to technologies, but not to data. You'll know how to process data, but you can't bring data to the next customer because
it's not ours, right? Yes.
Yeah,
the data stays as an asset with each of those large companies, and smaller startups are not going to have access to that sort of asset.
Yeah. And then it becomes always a question: would the company come and open and expose that data so others can use it for training? Maybe. Not everything, some of it. Right. Would we have open source alternatives? Today we have Whisper if we want to do speech to text, which is great. Instead of going and buying it from a Google or an Amazon or Microsoft or whatever. So we can go and use open source. Is that as good? In the case of Whisper, I understand that it is. In other cases, I don't know.
Yeah. Is
Crisp AI, which are doing noise suppression, better than trying to use NR noise? Probably. Okay, if you're using an NR noise, you need a lot of training data, which Crisp simply brought and built for their own use case. Again, I don't begrudge them. It's their business model and people buy that, so it makes sense for them. It would make sense for me if I would have done that, by the way. But I think the incentive for the large companies in the industry is to put things outside of WebRTC now, as opposed to in the past.
Yeah.
The only way for that to change might be if Google decides to open up WebRTC in ways that it haven't done until today, which means letting in more for the larger vendors to come and join in the actual development and in the direction that WebRTC itself is taking. Otherwise, it's going to stay like, we need it for Chrome and we need it for Google Meet, so let's do the minimal must here and put everything that we need inside Google Meet because we have to compete against the rest of the market and we don't want them to use our technology against us, which is likely a discussion that has been going on inside Google for the last 10 years of why are they putting things inside WebRTC.
Right.
It would be nicer to see this become a Linux than something else in the open source community.
Well, and so my last question here then for you is around open source. Is there an opportunity here for open source projects to help bridge that gap, or perhaps they face the same problem if they don't have the data as an asset either?
No, I think here it's not the case of data, it's the case of access. The access to WebRTC belongs to the browser vendors, period. Yes, there are the implementations of WebRTC, but none of them will be ever as big or as important as libWebRTC, because libWebRTC exists in all browsers. And the one that owns and controls and decides what goes into libWebRTC is Google at the end of the day. It's good that it's Google, not someone like Apple, by the way, based on how the companies operate and work.
Yeah.
But I think that at this point we can come and say, well, we might want something a bit better. Not like someone other than Google, but a bit different way of thinking of what needs to be done or not in WebRTC itself and the governance and around libWebRTC itself.
Makes sense. All right. Well, thank you very much, Sahi. We're out of time for today, but look forward to speaking with you again next month. We'll keep an eye on this industry trend, as with all the others with you. So thanks again for your time, Sahi. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Aaron.
Thanks for joining us for WebRTC Live. Visit our website at WebRTC.ventures to learn more about our custom design and development services, and to learn more about upcoming episodes of WebRTC Live.